Good morning, everyone. My name is Melissa Collins, and I'm with Kentucky Youth Advocates, and we are so happy that you all are here joining us today. Just as always, we are recording this forum for both a podcast and will also be shared later as a video. So we ask that you just stay muted, but we are taking questions and comments in the comment chat feature. So please feel free to drop in if you have anything to say, and we will try to answer those as we go along. Or also with the speakers through their panels. So with that, I will kick it to Dr. Terry Brooks.
Hey, Melissa, thanks so much. And, I think this is our 102nd forum. And so every time we do that, we say, welcome if you're a regular and welcome if you're a first timer. So I know that, and Melissa, I totally misunderstood. I thought my favorite flour was what you use to make apple pie, that powdered stuff, but I guess that's the wrong kind of flour. You guys are, the people who join this call are in the gifted and talented class. I know that, we're back to school, you're in the advanced program. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time convincing you of the importance of addressing adverse childhood experiences. I mean, you all content-wise know more than I do. You know that in Kentucky, that is an issue for not just a few, but for thousands of kids. You know that is an issue that affects learning outcomes, health status, and future prosperity. You know that is an issue that unless and until it is addressed, almost nothing else matters. I mean, you can have the greatest early childhood project or literacy initiative that you can think of, and there's going to be limited outcomes if we don't address adverse childhood experiences. That's why the initiative that we're going to talk about today, the Bloom campaign, is such an imperative for kids in Kentucky. And our forum today is really going to be two distinct parts. We're going to begin by talking about the backdrop of the campaign to make sure everybody's on the same page. And then we're moving into the guts. How's that for an elegant introduction to the second part, the guts of ACEs. So those of you who join this know that I'm typically not an AV prop guy, but I want to open today with a prop. So Melissa, you want to pop that slide up there? So here's the trick question. Which of those is different? The guy in the orange is Peyton Manning. The guy in the white is Super Bowl champion Tom Brady. In the purple is the University of Louisville's Heisman Trophy winner, now star quarterback for the Baltimore Ravens, Lamar Jackson. And the guy who has an unusual football outfit on is Barry Allen, who is the guy that runs the Gaines Foundation. So the answer to the question is Peyton Manning, because he's retired, and the other three individuals on the screen are active quarterbacks. And I want to introduce Barry by saying that he is the quarterback of the Bloom Initiative. I think my good friend and source of frequent counsel, Brother Chandler, will nod his head yes when I tell you that lots of folks were involved in constructing the Bloom Initiative. In fact, Ben, in a lot of ways, was the thought initiator of this. But the guy that took separate parts and took the idea and made it into a reality is Barry Allen, who has become a great partner with KYA. And it's very appropriate that we've asked Barry to kind of set the stage. He's going to tell you what the Bloom Initiative is, where it came from, and where it's going. So Barry, we appreciate the absolute spectacular work you've done to launch this. And it may be one of the few times that you've ever been like on that screen with Peyton, Lamar, and Tom. So I like your jersey, and take it away.
Well, thank you, Terry. That was pretty cool. Especially, uh, I went to college with Archie Manning, Peyton's
Oh,
dad.
okay. Okay.
And
Very
so
good.
I'm kind of thrilled that I'm not yet retired and Archie's son has retired.
Is.
But anyway, so I appreciate that. And also, I mean, I want to start out just by commending each and every one of the people on this call. I don't necessarily know all of you. I kind of looked over the list, but just for what each of you and your organizations are doing on a daily basis, to try to provide solutions to the challenges that our children and families are facing in the Commonwealth. And so with that, I will bring you greetings in behalf of what now are 32 grant makers from around Kentucky. We actually had 31 when we launched last week, but we've had another one join us as of yesterday. And I think I'm hoping that as this word spreads, that we'll actually have some others that will want to be a part of this, first time ever. We keep talking about this is the first time in the history of the Commonwealth, at least as far as anybody can tell, that a group of grant makers have come together and united in an effort to affect policy. And so I'm just thrilled by that. We as grant makers, we enjoy making grants. That's what, we think of when we first think of what our mission is as grant makers, is financial assistance to organizations that are meeting the needs of those that they serve. And I came to a kind of a conviction about 3 years ago and went to the trustees of the Genes Foundation and just simply made the case that if we really wanted to fulfill our true mission as a grant maker, and we really wanted to get involved in more than just temporarily relieving human need and suffering, and that we really wanted to effect long-term systemic change, that we had to somehow get engaged in public policy advocacy. And so, that was something our trustees took to heart and basically gave me a green light to begin a process of trying to figure out what does that look like? How do you do that? Because that's something, we had not been involved in. So basically, our little journey that has resulted in the Bloom Kentucky initiative started 3 years ago. And, I took it upon myself, knowing that the Genes Foundation alone could not do much in the way of policy advocacy. So I took it upon myself to invite a selected group of local Metro Louisville grant makers to a session that Ben Chandler and his staff hosted at the Foundation for Healthy Kentucky. And we had on the program that day the president of the Winthrop Rockefeller Foundation in Little Rock, Arkansas, whose sole purpose is public policy advocacy. That's all they do. And so the purpose of bringing those grant makers together was to test the waters on how much interest was there in the local community of grant makers, to get involved in policy advocacy. And even though the president of the Winthrop Rockefeller Foundation told us this was something that was really hard to do, it took a long time to do, and really laid it out for us. We left that session with quite a bit of interest in wanting to move forward in trying to find a way to come together for that purpose. And so we organized a smaller work group that represented that larger group to kind of do the field work on trying to figure out, what causes, how do we do it, and those kind of things. So I won't bore you with all the detail, but that group And let me just quickly, that group consisted of Mason Rummel of the Brown Foundation, Tess McNair, Tony Payton of the CENS Foundation, Jeff Polson from the Jewish Heritage Fund for Excellence, Kathy Knotts and I from Geens, and then Keith Inman from COSAR Charities. Now, we later added the Community Foundation of Louisville, and Tricia Finnegan, represents them. And we started meeting on a monthly basis. And we met for a little over 2 years. Every month, we would bring in different knowledge people, experts on different policy issues. We tried to, look out into the Commonwealth and see. We didn't want to reinvent the wheel. Who's doing what? Who could we piggyback on? What existing channels could we utilize? And one of those experts we invited in was Terry Brooks from Kentucky Youth Advocates, and also Ben Chandler, by the way. Ben served as kind of you kind of been our advisor along the way. We didn't ask Ben to devote his time to every meeting that we had, but we did keep him informed, and he did meet with us from time to time to help us try to identify and discover, a cause around which we could all come together. One of the challenges in collaboration among grant makers is that we all have our different mission and focus areas. Some of our foundations only focus on education. So if we're trying to do a policy advocacy effort around housing, then that foundation is probably not going to jump up and down about that, and maybe not even participate. So, we went around the world really and looking at all the different issues that we had some interest in. And it was when Terry came and began to talk about adverse childhood experiences, we just kind of came to the conviction that this is where education, health, children and families all intersect. And the case was so compelling that we came to the conclusion and the conviction that this would be the cause around which we would try to build a statewide coalition of grant makers. And so I took it upon myself to personally start contacting individual grant makers around the state. And I had an initial list of about 40 grant makers, most of whom I did not know. When you get outside the metro area, and some of the leaders in the larger foundation community, I just had not had any contact with them. So I just started contacting them and inviting them to participate. What we were asking for them was their human capital, because fortunately the local grant makers, which was part of our strategy, the local grant makers were able to provide all of the financial support that the Kentucky Youth Advocates team will need to conduct this initiative and this effort. But so it was, that was one of the nice things is, as I was asking them to participate, I didn't have to ask them for any financial support, just their human capital. And I was just, and still am, overwhelmed and humbled by the positive response that I began to get from all of these grant makers. I think, they all, and most of them all had to go to their board of trustees to get the approval to be a participant. And I've jokingly said that I've been doing cartwheels on the Belvedere outside my office since all of these foundations have been jumping in and saying, we want to be a part of this. This is definitely something we recognize the need for. And, we want to be a part of this effort. So we launched last week during the final session of the Grant Makers of Kentucky's annual conference, which was held at the Derby Museum, and had a really good group of grant makers. We had some of you, I think, were actually there. The Louisville group was there, and so we're just, really excited. We're grateful to Kentucky Youth Advocates and the team, the Bloom Kentucky team, that's going to be, already involved in leading us and guiding us through this effort. What we're hoping to do, I guess the way I stated, is that we want to educate, encourage, and enable the legislative, judicial, and executive branches of our state government around this whole issue of preventing and mitigating adverse childhood experiences. And Terry, I'll just close with one of the, as I thought about what we're doing, I thought of a quote from the late Fred Rogers of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, and he made this observation some years ago. He said, "The world tomorrow will belong to those who give it hope." And so I want to thank each and every one of you on this Zoom call for all the ways you and your organizations are giving the current and the future generation of the Commonwealth's children reasons for hope. So I'll be happy to answer any questions, Terry, that someone might have about it, but we feel like the momentum is there, and we're going to try to keep the momentum going and, get this job done.
Thank you so much for that, Barry. We really appreciate it. And, I think I see a lot of similarities between you and Fred Rogers when thinking about it. I haven't seen a lot of cardigans, but I think that you are enthusiastic. You bring that positivity and optimism, and you certainly give us hope as we continue to engage in this work and really grow it and build it and watch Bloom grow.
Yeah.
So thank you so much for taking some time with us this morning, and I hope that your travels are safe.
Thank you, Shannon, and thanks all. Have a good rest of the meeting.
Thank you. So before we jump right into our fantastic panelists, and we have some fantastic panelists, I wanted to just really quickly do a little bit of level setting and remind folks where we are and what we're talking about as far as the specifics around adverse childhood experiences. So this conversation is really focused on adverse childhood experiences, but also the pair of ACEs. And we'll talk more about what that is. But what we wanted to do was bring up a screen and just give you all a visual as well of that pair of ACEs. So if everyone can see, this is what we're going to be talking about today, not just the adverse childhood experiences that we see manifest as a result of the situations in the home, but we want to really talk about the soil that either nurtures or doesn't nurture those events that occur in those environments that create those risks for kids and families. So we're talking about poverty, we're talking about discrimination, violence, community disruption, that lack of social capital or social mobility. So we're going to jump in and hear from experts who can really speak to this arena. But I just wanted to make sure that everyone was on the same page before we had that conversation with the panelists. So it is my honor to get us kicked off, and we have three fantastic panelists. And what we're going to do is we're going to learn about what they do within and throughout the conversation, but we will start with just a brief introduction. So we have Ben Chandler with the Foundation for a Healthy Kentucky, who has a longstanding history of health policy expertise and influence. Joe Cruz, who is a rock star trainer with Bounce and is a phenomenal resource in this arena. And then also Cortney Emberson, who's with St. Joe's Children's Home, who I don't know very well, but I hear such fantastic things about. I'm really excited to get to learn more about her. So Ben, would you like to kick us off by doing a brief introduction and then round robining to Joe and then Courtney?
Sure. Thank you, Shannon, and thanks for inviting me to be on this thing. I am the head of the Foundation for Healthy Kentucky, and you all have heard me mention a few times already on this call, but we have been involved for many years, actually, our foundation has, in the issue of ACEs. As a funding organization, but as an organization that has also really been a part of the nuts and bolts of the work of the Bounce Coalition. We got together with the Bounce Coalition several years ago. I want to say that by now, I lose track of time, but by now it's been 8 or 9 years, I think, since we actually first funded the Bounce Coalition efforts in Jefferson County. Those efforts were really astounding. And Joe maybe can talk about that in a little bit, but those efforts ended up with tangible results that really helped the schools that were involved. The program was evaluated. The evaluation came back showing really remarkable strides that were made. So we as a foundation have been very involved in this. And I've also been involved, as Barry said, with trying to get this thing underway, this whole effort, because we're embarking now, I think, on a historic effort. ACEs has been an effort amongst policy wonks and people on the ground who are trying to help with certain schools and so forth. But what we're talking about now is an effort to educate the entire state about this subject. We're talking about a legislature with 138 members, many of whom probably don't have any idea at this point what ACEs even are. And they don't have a good, strong, fundamental understanding of childhood trauma and the repercussions of that trauma. And that's really one of the main things that we want to accomplish in this effort is a systematic effort to educate policy leaders from one end of the state to the other so they understand the importance of this subject, how it can change lives throughout Kentucky, how it can create a cadre of citizens in this state who can perform better, who can have more fulfilling lives, and can have better health. And one of the things that these foundations wanted to do, they were looking at a subject that they all could agree on. And Barry mentioned this earlier, but this is really the intersection of health and education. Every foundation in Kentucky has some bit of education interest and some of health interest, one or the other. And this was the thing that really touched everybody. Yeah, and it does touch everybody because it touches our children. Yeah. Let me hand it over now to Joe.
Okay, hello everyone. How are you all doing? It's great to see everyone today. Basically, when we're talking about ACEs, we're talking about adverse childhood experiences that include abuse, neglect, and household challenges. And then when we get into the pair of ACEs, that was actually created to illustrate the relationship between adversities in families and adversities in communities. So when we look at that pair of ACEs where we saw the tree and we saw up at the top, there was the tree portion with the leaves. On the leaves, those were things like divorce, mental illness, emotional and sexual abuse, maternal depression, and those leaves are wilted. And then when we look down into the soil, we understand that this tree has been planted in poor soil, right? And so that's why those leaves are looking that way. So the above portion of the picture, the tree is the adverse childhood experiences, and beneath it in the soil are the root causes, and those are adverse community experiences. Things like poverty, discrimination, poor housing quality, violence, even community disruption. So building community resilience created this diagram so that we could see the differences and basically understand the relationship between adversities in families and adversities in communities. And it's so funny that in the beginning, you all asked what your favorite flower was or what you're growing, because I automatically thought of my garden. And in my garden, I have strawberries, and everybody in the house loves strawberries. So I've been on my strawberries, and I've been watering them and just weeding, and I've been all over them. And for some reason, every time I've gone outside, they would get lighter in color. Like they weren't deep red, they were getting lighter in color and they were getting puffy and they almost looked like they were filled, you know. And so I looked it up and it said it was moldy. And I'm like, but how? I've been weeding, I've been watering, I've been doing everything I need to do. And it's because I was watering too much. Strawberries don't need that much water. You can water them once a week and they're great, right? So I was over watering them. And all I could see was a symptom of this not so good looking strawberry. But what I had to do was figure out what was going on underneath the soil, which was my fault. I was overwatering, right? So the same systems that build us up can break us down, right? And that's kind of what they're doing with the tree. They're showing that these leaves, the adverse childhood experiences are the symptoms, right? But you have to dig deep down to understand what's going on and why we have those symptoms. And it's because of all these root causes that are happening within the community and that are impacting, you know, people within the community. But those are the differences there. Do you all want me to get into racial trauma right now?
Well,
Or do we
you know,
continue on?
Joe, if you, I would like for you to introduce yourself too.
I'm sorry.
Because we needed to give folks a little background on you, and then we're going to have Courtney do the same. And then, yes, I want us to talk about that racial trauma piece as it relates to the tree.
Apologies. So my name is Jo Cruz. I'm an independent consultant and also a trainer for Bounce. And I've been with Bounce for about a year now. However, when the Bounce Coalition came about in Kentucky, I was a part of all of the things. So I've been a part of the Bounce Coalition, now Bounce, for probably about 8 or 9 years. But I believe very, very heavily in what it is that is going on with the trainings that are happening and with the education trying to be pushed out to the community and people surrounding.
For that. And Courtney?
I wanted to first start out with thanking you all for inviting me to be a part of this panel. I'm super excited to be here and to talk with you all. My name is Cortney Emberson, and I'm a licensed professional clinical counselor, and I'm also the Director of Clinical Services at St. Joseph Children's Home. I've worked with childhood trauma survivors for the past 10 years. The past 4 of those years have been here at St. Joe's. For those of you that aren't familiar with St. Joe's, we have a therapeutic foster care and adoption program, as well as a residential treatment program. We work with children from all across the state of Kentucky who have been removed from their homes due to things like abuse, neglect, and dependency. So we are working every day with Kentucky's most vulnerable youth. So we have seen on the front lines how ACEs and how childhood trauma have affected these youth. So I'm just really excited to be here and to help answer any questions and provide you all with some extra insight.
Thanks for that, Courtney. And so, as you can tell, we've got some passionate folks around the virtual table. I do want to mention that Courtney and St. Joe's are also in partnership with the Bounce Coalition, working on creating a trauma-informed environment over at St. Joe's with the help of the Jewish Heritage Fund for Excellence. So we're really excited about that work, and they have just been phenomenal to work with. Let's talk a little bit about Joe and go back to that pair of ACEs and talk about the understanding and issues that we see within that soil and the systems in relation to racial trauma. Do you want to give us a little bit of background, and then I'd like for us to talk a bit about what that looks like on the ground as far as mitigating some of those ACEs and have everyone kind of weigh in on that.
Okay, so you wanted me to start first with what? Tell me one more time.
I want you to talk a little bit about that pair of ACEs, and then in particular the racial trauma piece and the work that you've been doing in regards to that.
Okay. Well, I will say my colleague is not here, but Carol Frame and I created the Bounce 201, and in collaboration, but it's on racial trauma. So what we did there is we talked about what racial trauma is, the impacts of racial trauma, and then also trauma-informed interventions, right? So when we talk about racial trauma, we kind of set it up with a framework of understanding interpersonal, personal, systemic, and vicarious. And so when we're talking about the pair of ACEs, we're really talking about systemic, systemic racism. And basically when we're talking about that, like racial trauma is the cumulative effects of stress, physical, emotional, it doesn't matter, due to racism. And it's important to understand that it involves ongoing exposure, re-exposure, and injury on the collective and individual levels, right? When we get into systemic racism, we have to understand that there are inequities embedded into systems that prefer white over BIPOC people. So when we're looking into the roots of this tree, we're seeing those inequities, right, that are embedded into this system, which, as you all know, can create many, many, many problems and lead to those symptoms on the leaves, no matter what, whether white, BIPOC, doesn't matter. But when it comes around to systemic racism, it's like a trifold. If you look at the statistics, there are things like the Black population makes up 12%. Black people make up 12% of the population, but 33% of the prison system. There are things like there was over 1,500 anti-Asian reports in 1 month right after COVID hit. Things of that nature that's community disruption, right? That is that's really violence towards people and discrimination towards people, and that builds into the inequities that are in those systems, in the roots of those systems. If you want to get out of or try to mitigate things of those nature, you have to get stakeholders like I'm sorry, what was his name? The gentleman said earlier, getting stakeholders together, right? Having people to come in and do asset planning, understanding that we do have, there are things that we can do to mitigate, but it has to be on a large scale. It's not going to be individuals. It's not going to be one organization. It has to be a community of organizations and the collaboration of masterminds in order to mitigate these inequities. You can do action planning on the building community resilience. There's a website, building community resilience, I think it's .org. You can go in and actually map out, and it actually gives you suggestions of the areas where we're lacking of things that you can do in order to mitigate. But developing policy agendas, making certain that you're engaging stakeholders and action planning, things of that nature. Making certain that as an organization, you're practicing the core principles of trauma-informed care, right? And including in that, because those core principles are trustworthiness, empowerment, safety, collaboration, and choice, but you have to include equity in that, right? It doesn't include equity. You have to include equity, and you have to understand that that's a big portion of what it is that we're dealing with right now.
Let's wrap our hands around this a little bit more and get into some more specific examples. And in particular, Courtney, I would love to talk a bit about what St. Joe's has been working on in becoming a trauma-informed environment, as Joe had mentioned, and what that looks like. And then we're definitely going to delve into policy, and I think Ben is going to have a lot of expertise to lend to that discussion.
So St. Joe's has been working for a long time at just, looking at an overall scope of how we can continue to improve and grow as an agency and move towards a trauma-informed approach with not only our youth and our frontline staff, but across the board. So here at St. Joe's, we screen for ACEs during our admission process in both programs. This specific screening tool, in conjunction with other trauma screeners and assessments, really help to guide the child's individualized treatment while they're here in our care. We've also started to incorporate the PEARLs along with the ACEs to really look at some of those other environmental factors, to look at things such as how bullying is affecting our children, how community violence is affecting them, things like food and housing insecurities that the actual ACE study doesn't capture. So we're looking to expand that as well. But on the flip side, we also want to screen for those protective factors. So what characteristics do our children currently possess that can help them reduce the effects of stressful life events? Because as clinicians, we see that ACEs can provide really valuable insight into just the overall difficulties that those children have faced in their lives. We've been able to take that information and kind of use it to help train our frontline staff as well. So those staff that are with them through the thick and the thin. As you mentioned, we have been working closely to partner with the Bounce Coalition to provide trauma-informed care training here at St. Joe's. And we've really done that from the ground up. So we've revamped internal policies and procedures to reflect a trauma-informed language. We've changed even our employee evaluations to have that trauma-informed language. We offer that training to every single staff here at St. Joe's, whether that be somebody in our residential program or our foster care program or our kitchen staff, our HR staff, so anybody that walks in the doors of St. Joe's is going to have that same training, which has been super beneficial to us, regardless of their role. We've also been striving to become a qualified residential treatment program. So that also means that under the Family First Prevention Services Act, we've worked to meet certain criteria, including having a trauma-informed treatment model to address the clinical needs of the children in our care. We know that they struggle severely with emotional and behavioral problems. So having that holistic approach to their care and their treatment is super, super important to us here at St. Joe's.
And the work that y'all are doing with Bounce is, hopefully, and I think will be just culture changing within St. Joe's. And I think that the beauty of what the Foundation for a Healthy Kentucky does in relation to really being a front runner in supporting work on systems change related to adverse childhood experiences. So a question that I have, and maybe Ben can attend to this and then other folks weigh in, but how do systems like schools or youth serving organizations get buy-in from staff as we work towards like this education and awareness building? So how do we get other folks who work with kids and families or who work within these big systems? Sometimes it's superintendents and principals, sometimes it's CEOs. Like, how do we get them on board with wrapping their heads around adverse childhood experiences and then putting in these trauma-informed practices?
I think you just simply got to start educating people. This is a subject that is foreign to a lot of folks. They don't think about it. They don't realize how many things create traumas and how these traumas affect performance and ultimately the lives of the young people that they're in charge of in the future. So going about the business of educating thought leaders, leaders of organizations, I think is really probably the single biggest thing that we've got to do. And it's a Herculean task. There's so many people who have to understand the import of this. There's plenty of data on it. And I think none of us, of course, want to do anything that's not supported by data. But the data is very, very clear on this, that if you have a certain number of adverse childhood experiences, if you suffer from trauma in your childhood, you're almost guaranteed, as the system works now, to not perform as well. We've got to attack this in two ways. The first way is we've got to look for policies that reduce the incidences of trauma. If we can get trauma to occur less often, obviously we're better off. But we have things like COVID, for instance, which creates trauma. The opioid problem, any family that's impacted by opioids, any family that's impacted by COVID, and a variety of other things, even divorce in the family. These are things that cause trauma in the lives of children. And to the extent that we can reduce these things by aiming at what we refer to as the social determinants of health, I think we make big strides. But of course, we can't get rid of all these things. We're not going to end divorce in the Commonwealth of Kentucky. That's going to keep happening. So what we've got to do is we've got to create a level of resiliency on the part of these children. And we've got to teach educators who have control of these children through many hours of the day to recognize that children are suffering from these traumas and to look at them a different way. One of the great comments that I've heard throughout the process that Bounce is that uses on a regular basis, is we've got to look at children in terms of what happened to this child rather than what is wrong with this child. And so often people say, well, what's wrong with you? It should not be looked at that way. You ought to look at a young person and say, well, what happened to this child and what can I do to create a higher level of resiliency for this child?
Yeah, and Ben, I'm so glad that you brought that up, because that's a real paradigm shift, right? We need people thinking very differently about how they're approaching not just kids, but also adults as well, in a trauma-informed way. And Joe, I know that you are responsible for educating folks on how to do that, in part with the bounce trainings. What does that systems change within like schools or youth serving settings? What does that look like for you? Like, what does success look like in that regard? What are some of the roadblocks?
Well, I would say success looks like, just like what Ben just said, is educating as many people as possible. That one pager that we have when we start all of our trainings, there are 3 pieces. Is that ACEs are common, right? They have lifelong effects, but they do not determine your destiny. And in that first little clip, is 24% of Kentucky youth have at least 2 ACEs. That's double the national standard, right? We're ranked number 8 in our nation in terms of, having that many ACEs. So I think that success looks like educating as many people as possible, because when you look at our community alone and how high our numbers are, it's really important to take a step back and wonder why, and then wonder what we can do about it. And if we have, I think it's 64% have at least 1 ACE, right? So that's 2/3 of our population. We should be on it, right? So once you know about something, then you can do something about it. I would say that the potential challenges that can get in the way could be financial, right? So getting this information out to everybody is going to be, it might be a financial struggle. However, I would think also, we don't have the best system in place to get information to one another, just about the information, right? Just letting other people know that we have this resource. There's not one common mainstream network that we all use. And I think that is a barrier for a lot of things that a lot of issues that we struggle with in the Kentuckian area. But yeah.
I think that's something that we can continue, like within this forum, within Bloom, Kentucky, the folks who are connected to that, helping to really amplify and educate, like you and Ben said, and really get that information out regularly, consistently, and just keep it. We've got to be persistent in that regard.
And you wouldn't imagine, sorry, I know you didn't ask for additional, but you couldn't believe the amount of people that I've trained that have said, oh, wow, I've never heard this information before. And adverse childhood experience, we've already got a pair of ACEs. They are doing, I think in Japan, it's like a triad. I mean, like there's so many different things that are happening right now, and we are really far behind. So we really need to get the word out really, really badly.
Yeah. So Courtney, what do you think success looks like for St. Joe's in this regard?
Similar to what Ben and Joe have said, just about being able to provide that psychoeducation to our frontline staff, the staff that are dealing with these children and interacting with them on a daily basis, but also our foster parents as well. A lot of times they have that want and that desire to have the knowledge. A lot of times they don't have the luxury of having all the background information when we get a new child in residential treatment, so they don't necessarily have all the backstory of the things that these children have been through. So the more that we can train them to recognize those traumatic experiences and those triggers for those children, the more that we can educate our, HR staff and our community partners, the better care these kids are going to receive. So I think for us here at St. Joe's, it's just, broadening that scope of who we're able to reach through training, and then providing ongoing training. So not just initially at hire or initially at placement of a child, but providing that ongoing training is critical to us as well. And then for the kids, I think it looks like just seeing their overall growth and development throughout their time here at St. Joe's, and them being able to process through some of that really difficult trauma that they maybe have not had the opportunity to do so yet, and learning ways to you know, as they mentioned earlier, you know, this doesn't have to be your destiny. So how can we help be an advocate for them while they're here?
Yeah. And Courtney, when I worked in residential, what I also saw with like my peers and other staff is like oftentimes the helpers are still processing and figuring out how they're healing from things that they've experienced as well. So not only is it a benefit, that knowledge, a benefit for the work that you're doing with other people, but oftentimes for yourself too, to recognize how you've responded to things or how to heal from things.
Absolutely. I think that's a big part of our training here at St. Joe's, you know, looking at the vicarious trauma and the impact that trauma has on our staff as well. You know, even if it's not been something that they've been through personally, when you're interacting with people that have been through traumatic life experiences day in and day out, that can definitely take a toll on you. So I think, you know, ensuring that they have the toolkit to not only care for the children here at St. Joe's, but also for themselves is absolutely key.
Yeah, yeah. So I'm going to combine kind of two questions into one, but I think they're closely related. We know that in Kentucky, the School Safety and Resiliency Act, and then on the federal level, the Family First Prevention Services Act are both examples of how state and federal policy has influenced trauma-informed care, whether it's within the schools or within, Courtney had mentioned the QRTP, Qualified Residential Treatment programs that serve young people who have experienced abuse or neglect. And we know that policy change is important. We've talked about it. Ben has mentioned it. And Bloom, Kentucky is really focused on providing and getting avenues towards that policy change, both on the prevention side, but then also on the mitigation side. So why is policy change needed to prevent and mitigate ACEs? I know Ben talked a little bit about this, but you know, in your experience with the things that we've seen, like why policy change?
Well, it's really pretty simple. You know, we can try to dig this out one school at a time, one community at a time. We can work on the grassroots level, and that work is all very, very important. And it's meaningful. It affects individuals' lives. But if you can elevate this to a larger level, a more broad level that includes policymakers throughout an entire state, and get some kind of state effort, coordinated state effort to try to focus on issues like this, you can affect so many more people and get so many more resources into the effort. If you can get people to understand how important this is, what a difference this will make in the lives of young people, you can have a tremendous impact over a much broader level. Now, I think we've got a real opportunity right now, because this is an issue. I mean, I don't know if you all have realized this or not, but we're in a pretty polarized political situation in this country. Republicans and Democrats agree on almost nothing, and it's very, very difficult to get anything done. I think we actually have an issue here that they can all get behind. If we do this properly, I think that we can attract very, very strong support from Republicans and Democrats alike to try to fix a problem like this. This affects every community. It is, as was already mentioned, it's widespread here in Kentucky. So many people are affected by it, and it's clearly holding us back. It's holding our state back from being the best that it can be and getting the most out of the resources and lives that we have here in Kentucky. It's really an outrage that we let this happen, and we've got to do something about it. And I believe that now, if we approach our leaders, we've got, again, 138 legislators. If every single one of them understands what's at stake here, I think you will find that there will be a high level of interest in trying to address these things. We also have a situation now where there's some excess money available from the federal government that we can tap into, and I think there will be some interest in trying to fund some of these efforts as well. So I think the time is quite propitious.
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead, please.
Please, Joe.
Oh, okay. I definitely agree. I think that it starts with policy. If you think about things like redlining, which was started back in like the 1930s, the effects are still evident today. Redlining was set in place because of policy, right? Almost 100 years later, we can still look at those redlined areas and you can see life expectancy is 10 years shorter. You can see the food deserts. You can see the lack of resources in those same areas that were redlined almost 100 years ago. So policy is definitely important. When we say these are deep-seated inequities, right? You have to reach deep down on the soil, and rip up the roots and then replant it, right? My colleague Carol, I know I keep on mentioning her, that she's amazing. I wish she could be here today, but she always describes it as saying, when you purchase a home, you're purchasing that home. If you don't build it brand new, when you purchase that home, you purchase whatever is going on in that home, right? And it can look great on the outside, but the plumbing might be jacked, right? The electricity might be faulty. There are things that are wrong with that home. So where we are today in the US is we have taken on something that had weak bones, way before we got here, but we still have to take care of it, right? It's still ours. We can't pretend like what happened long ago did not happen. It still happened, and we're still suffering the effects of it. But we have to do the things that are necessary to bring us to success. And I definitely think that legislation and things of that nature are the way. Policy change is the way to go.
Mm-hmm. I love that you keep bringing in the roots and the soil in particular. We need to nurture it, and that is what policy can help to do. Courtney, any before we close out and transition, what do you think are the ways the advocates on this call can take action around ACEs?
I would just encourage everybody to do their research, ask questions. As we've talked about, it starts from the ground up. So, we talk about having buy-in with our staff, but we also need buy-in with the community, with the partners here in Kentucky. We know that research has shown that ACEs have multi-generational effects. So this means that if we don't get a handle on mitigating them at the ground level, it's going to continue to affect our population and our youth and our people for years to come. So people that have an increased ACE score are much more likely to have difficulties later on in life. So as advocates here in the state of Kentucky, we're working with the nation's most vulnerable youth. We rank at the top consistently for children that have been abused and neglected. It's not a me issue or a you issue. This is an us issue. So we have to partner together as the Commonwealth of Kentucky to really do what we can do to help mitigate these ACEs from the ground level. So research, reach out, ask questions, and definitely I'm always here as a resource. If anybody has any specific questions for me, feel free to reach out to me as well.
Thanks for that, Courtney. So I'm going to ask Ben to give his one recommendation on what advocates on this call can take action on. Joe is also going to give one recommendation, and then Courtney Downs from KYA is going to just wrap it all up for us.
Contact your legislators. I mean, that's the bottom line. As many of us who can talk to people in the legislature about how important this thing is, if they hear from their constituents, it'll make a difference.
I would say become an anti-racist. Do the work, look up the information that you need to look up, and amplify voices of BIPOC people if and when you can.
Awesome. Thank you. So I'll go ahead and jump in because this is such a great conversation. I feel like we could just keep going. But thank you, Barry Allen, and then also to our panelists, Cortney Emberson, Joe Cruz, and Ben Chandler for joining us today. One of the biggest takeaways I think for me is just remembering that adversity is not destiny. So ACEs are far more prevalent than many of us realize. So having these conversations about these direct experiences and these immersive environments being sources of trauma for children is critical for all of us to understand as we work towards better supporting kids and families. And as we heard repeatedly, it really starts from the ground up, and it is hard work, but without it, we will continue to see these increased ACE scores and more challenging and negative long-term outcomes for families in our communities. To learn more about the Bloom Kentucky initiative that we heard about from Barry earlier. Visit bloomkentucky.org. And as always, we want to thank Aetna Better Health of Kentucky for their support of today's Advocate Virtual Forum. Next week, we are going to be continuing this conversation on August 18th. So we will be talking about ACEs again with legislators and kind of discussing how Frankfurt fits into the narrative of preventing and mitigating ACEs. As always, there will be a follow-up email with a recording of today's forum. All of the resources that were discussed will be shared with you all as well, and a link to sign up for the next week's forum. So thank you guys for joining and have a wonderful day.